Restaurant owner bans Melania Trump for wearing a MAGA hat. What happens after shocks the world? It was a quiet afternoon in the Copper Spoon, a trendy downtown restaurant known for its farm-to-table menu and upscale ambience. Business was steady, and the staff bustled around, serving customers with polished efficiency. The owner, Greg Tanner, stood behind a bar, watching everything with a critical eye. He prided himself on running one of the most exclusive spots in town, a place where only the right kind of clientele were welcome. That's when the doors swung open and a hush fell over the restaurant. Melania Trump walked in, wearing a cream coat, dark sunglasses, and a red MAGA hat perched prominently on her head. She looked poised, confident, and completely unfazed by the curious glances directed her way. A hostess approached her, her smile faltering slightly when she noticed the hat. "Welcome to the Copper Spoon. Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," Melania said, her voice calm and composed. "It should be under my name, Melania." The hostess glanced nervously at Greg, who was already making his way toward them, his jaw clenched. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Greg said, folding his arms across his chest. "But we have a strict policy here. We don't serve people wearing political merchandise. That hat, it's not welcome in this restaurant." Melania raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Greg said, his tone firm. "You'll have to leave. I won't have this place turned into a political battleground." A murmur spread through the restaurant as diners whispered to one another, their eyes darting between Greg and Melania. Melania stood there for a moment, taking in the situation. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the tension crackling in the air. "I see," she said finally, her voice steady. "I didn't realize this restaurant had such selective policies." Greg didn't back down. "It's nothing personal. But we have to draw a line somewhere." Without another word, Melania turned and walked out of the restaurant, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The door closed behind her, and the silence in the room was deafening. Greg exhaled, his shoulders relaxing. "Crisis averted," he muttered, returning to the bar. But the crisis was far from over. By the time Melania reached her car, news of the incident was already spreading like wildfire. A diner had recorded the entire exchange on their phone and posted it on social media with a caption, "Melania Trump kicked out of the Copper Spoon for wearing a MAGA hat." Within minutes, the video went viral. Thousands of comments flooded in, some supporting the restaurant's stance, others outraged by the blatant discrimination. News outlets picked up the story, and before long, it was being discussed on every major network. Greg had no idea how fast things were spiraling out of control. Back at the restaurant, the phones began ringing nonstop. Some calls were from reporters seeking statements, while others were from furious supporters demanding answers. Negative reviews started pouring in online, dragging the restaurant's once stellar rating into dangerous territory. Melania, however, remained calm. She watched the media frenzy from her living room, sipping tea and scrolling through the endless stream of headlines. First Lady turned away at popular restaurant Red One. Restaurant owner sparks national debate with ban on MAGA hats, read another. Her phone buzzed with messages from friends and family, urging her to issue a statement. But Melania knew better than to rush into things. Instead, she called her assistant. "Let's schedule a press conference," she said. "But not yet. I want to give this some time to unfold." Greg, meanwhile, was starting to feel the pressure. What he had thought was a principled stand had quickly turned into a nightmare. Protesters gathered outside the restaurant, holding signs that read "Free Speech for All" and "No More Discrimination." At the same time, some of his regular customers canceled their reservations, not wanting to get caught in the crossfire of such a high-profile controversy. "Maybe we should apologize," one of his staff members suggested hesitantly. Greg shook his head. "No, we're standing by our policy. This will blow over." But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The next morning, the controversy surrounding the Copper Spoon dominated headlines. News anchors debated the incident, social media buzzed with heated discussions, and hashtags like #MelaniaBanned and #TheIncident trended worldwide. For Greg, it felt like the world was closing in on him. He had expected some pushback, sure, but this level of backlash was beyond anything he had imagined. His email inbox overflowed with angry messages, and the restaurant's voicemail system was completely jammed with calls from outraged citizens demanding an apology. Outside, the protest had grown larger. People with signs crowded the sidewalk, chanting slogans and blocking the entrance to the restaurant. Some carried American flags. Others wore MAGA hats in solidarity with Melania. Reporters camped out across the street, waiting for any new development. Their cameras trained on the front door like hungry hawks circling their prey. Greg tried to maintain control, but his nerves were wearing thin. Meanwhile, Melania carefully planned her response. She wasn't interested in revenge or making things worse for Greg. She simply wanted to set the record straight and share her perspective. Her press conference was scheduled for the following afternoon at a local community center. By the time she arrived, the room was packed with journalists, photographers, and curious onlookers. Melania stepped onto the small stage, her expression calm but resolute. She wore a simple, elegant white coat with no visible logos or political symbols. She didn't need them. Her presence was enough to command attention. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and measured. "Thank you for being here today." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on her. "As many of you know, I was recently asked to leave a restaurant because of the hat I was wearing," she continued. "The incident has sparked a great deal of discussion, much of it heated. I want to take this opportunity to address what happened and share my thoughts." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I believe in freedom of expression. I believe that every individual has the right to their own beliefs and opinions. But I also believe in kindness, respect, and understanding. These values should guide us, especially in moments of disagreement." The audience listened intently, hanging on her every word. "The decision made by the restaurant owner was unfortunate," Melania said. "But I want to be clear, I harbor no ill will toward him or his staff. We live in a country where people are free to make their own choices, even if we don't agree with them. My hope is that we can use this moment not to divide further, but to learn from it." She smiled softly, her eyes scanning the crowd. Kindness and understanding have the power to heal far more than anger and conflict ever will. The room erupted in applause, flashes from cameras lighting up the room. Back at the Copper Spoon, Greg watched the press conference on his phone, his face pale. He hadn't expected Melania to respond with such grace and compassion. He had braced himself for anger, for public condemnation, but instead, she had taken the high road. And now he was starting to realize how badly he had misjudged the situation. His staff gathered around him, their faces anxious. "What do we do now?" one of them asked. Greg swallowed hard. He knew there was only one option left. "We make it right," he said quietly. That evening, Greg released a public statement. "To our valued customers and the community," it began. "In light of recent events, I want to offer my sincerest apologies to Mrs. Melania Trump. My decision to ask her to leave was wrong and not in line with the values of respect and inclusion that we strive to uphold. I take full responsibility for my actions, and I deeply regret any hurt or offense I caused." He went on to acknowledge the lessons he had learned from the incident and pledged to implement new policies focused on fostering a more welcoming environment. The response was swift and overwhelming. While some remained skeptical of his sincerity, many applauded his willingness to admit his mistake and take steps to improve. A few days later, Greg received a letter in the mail. The envelope was cream-colored, with a gold seal on the back. He opened it carefully, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a handwritten note from Melania. "Dear Greg," it read, "thank you for your thoughtful apology. We all make mistakes. It's how we respond to them that defines us. I wish you and your restaurant nothing but success in the future. Best regards, Melania." Greg stared at the note for a long moment, his eyes misting over. He had expected criticism, maybe even scorn. But instead, Melania had shown him the very kindness and understanding she had spoken about in her press conference. It was a humbling moment, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. In the weeks that followed, the Copper Spoon slowly began to recover. The protests died down, the media moved on to the next big story, and regular customers started to return. Greg kept his promise, organizing workshops for his staff on empathy, customer service, and conflict resolution. The experience had changed him, and he was determined to ensure it made the restaurant stronger. One afternoon, as he stood by the bar watching the bustling dining room, he noticed a couple walking in, both of them wearing red MAGA hats. For a brief moment, his heart skipped a beat. But then he smiled and walked over to greet them personally. "Welcome to the Copper Spoon," he said warmly. "We're so glad to have you here." In the end, the incident that had nearly destroyed his business became the catalyst for its rebirth. Greg had learned that true leadership wasn't about sticking to rigid policies or making statements. It was about listening, adapting, and leading with compassion. And for Melania, it was a reminder of the power of grace in the face of adversity. Because sometimes the most shocking outcome of all wasn't conflict, it was forgiveness. In the following weeks, the Copper Spoon became the center of a broader conversation about tolerance, respect, and the importance of second chances. The restaurant that had once been known only for its high-end dining was now a symbol of transformation, a place that had learned, adapted, and grown from its mistakes. But the road to recovery was far from easy. Even though the protests outside the restaurant had stopped and the media had shifted focus, the damage to Greg's reputation remained. There were still people who refused to return, unwilling to forgive what they saw as an act of discrimination. Online reviews were a mixed bag. Some praised the restaurant's newfound commitment to inclusivity, while others continued to post harsh comments. For Greg, it was a humbling experience. He realized that rebuilding trust would take more than just an apology. It would require sustained effort and genuine change. One afternoon, as he stood behind the bar, Greg noticed an elderly man sitting alone at a corner table. He recognized the man, Mr. Hawkins, a retired schoolteacher and a regular at the Copper Spoon before the controversy. Greg hadn't seen him since the incident with Melania. Gathering his courage, Greg walked over. "Mr. Hawkins," he said with a smile, "it's good to see you again. Can I get you your usual?" Mr. Hawkins looked up, his eyes studying Greg carefully. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever come back," he said slowly, "but I've been watching how you've handled everything. It takes a lot of character to admit when you're wrong and try to make it right." Greg nodded, his throat tightening. "Thank you. I've learned a lot from this experience. I'm just trying to do better every day." The older man smiled. "Well, that's all any of us can do." He extended his hand, and Greg shook it firmly. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a step toward redemption. As word spread about Greg's commitment to change, more and more customers returned. They came not just for the food, but to witness the transformation for themselves. Greg made a point of being present on the restaurant floor every day, greeting customers personally and listening to their feedback. He hosted community events at the restaurant, inviting speakers to talk about empathy, diversity, and kindness. Slowly but surely, the Copper Spoon became more than just a place to eat. It became a gathering spot for people from all walks of life. One night, during a particularly busy dinner service, Greg noticed a familiar face walking through the door. Melania Trump had returned. This time, she wasn't wearing a MAGA hat. She wore a simple black dress and a warm smile. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as she walked in, the weight of the moment palpable. Greg felt his heart race. He wiped his hands on his apron and made his way over to her. "Mrs. Trump," he said, his voice steady but humble. "Welcome back. It's an honor to have you here." Melania extended her hand, and Greg shook it gratefully. "Thank you, Greg," she said. "I heard you've been doing some amazing work here. I wanted to see it for myself." "Please," Greg said, gesturing toward a table near the window. "Let me take care of everything tonight." As Melania sat down, the tension in the room eased. The diners returned to their conversations, but there was a buzz of excitement in the air. Throughout the evening, Greg personally oversaw every detail of Melania's meal, ensuring everything was perfect. The staff, inspired by her presence, went above and beyond, delivering impeccable service. When the meal was over, Greg returned to her table. "I hope everything was to your liking," he said. "It was wonderful," Melania replied. "Thank you, Greg. You've created something truly special here." Greg smiled, relief washing over him. "That means more than you know." As Melania stood to leave, she turned back to him. "One more thing," she said. "Keep going. Keep growing. This is just the beginning." The next day, news of Melania's return to the Copper Spoon spread like wildfire. This time, the headlines were different. "Melania Trump returns to forgive and support restaurant that banned her," read one. "A story of redemption and growth," read another. For Greg, it felt like a new chapter had truly begun. The restaurant continued to thrive, becoming a beacon of hope for others who believe in the power of change and second chances. Greg frequently received letters and emails from people who had faced similar challenges, thanking him for showing them that it was possible to turn mistakes into opportunities for growth. Months later, Greg stood outside the Copper Spoon, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. It had been a long, difficult journey, but standing there, he felt a deep sense of peace. He thought about everything that had happened, the lessons learned, the relationships built, and the growth that had come from it all. It wasn't the path he had expected, but it had led him exactly where he needed to be. One last time, Greg stepped back into the restaurant, ready to greet the evening's guests with a smile. Because in the end, every mistake was just another opportunity to learn, grow, and to become something greater. And the Copper Spoon had become a place where those lessons lived on, where every table told a story of resilience, forgiveness, and the unbreakable power of kindness. As the weeks turned into months, the transformation of the Copper Spoon became a case study in the power of personal growth and resilience. Articles were written about the restaurant's remarkable turnaround, and Greg found himself invited to speak at business seminars and community events. At first, Greg felt uncomfortable with the attention. He was just a restaurant owner who had made a mistake. Nothing more, nothing less. But as he stood before audiences, sharing his story with humility and openness, he realized that his journey was resonating with people in ways he hadn't expected. He told them about the moment he asked Melania to leave, how he had felt justified at the time, and how everything had spiraled out of control. He didn't shy away from admitting how wrong he had been or how difficult it was to rebuild the trust he had lost. But most importantly, he spoke about the lessons he had learned along the way, the importance of listening, the courage to admit when you're wrong, and the transformative power of forgiveness. Every time he finished speaking, people would line up to shake his hand, share their own experiences, and thank him for his honesty. "You gave me hope," one woman told him after a seminar. "I've made mistakes in my own business, and I thought I'd never recover. But you showed me it's possible to come back stronger." Greg was humbled by their words. He realized that his story wasn't just about one incident at a restaurant. It was about something much bigger. It was about second chances, personal growth, and the belief that it's never too late to change. Meanwhile, Melania's continued support made all the difference. She returned to the Copper Spoon several times over the next few months, each visit drawing more attention and further solidifying the restaurant's new reputation. What had once been a trendy, exclusive spot for the city's elite was now a welcoming space for people from all walks of life. During one of her visits, Melania sat down with Greg for a quiet conversation over coffee. "You've done an amazing job turning things around," she said, her eyes warm with admiration. "I've been watching closely, and I'm proud of what you've accomplished." "Thank you," Greg said sincerely. "But I couldn't have done it without your grace and kindness. You could have destroyed me with a single word, but instead, you chose to lift me up. I'll always be grateful for that." Melania smiled. "We're all on this journey together. Sometimes, we just need someone to believe in us." As the Copper Spoon continued to thrive, Greg began to think about the future. He wanted to take everything he had learned and use it to help others. The idea came to him late one night as he sat in his office, flipping through letters from customers who had shared their own stories of personal growth and redemption. What if we created a program, he thought, something that helps people get back on their feet after they've made mistakes? The next day, he called a meeting with his staff. "I have an idea," Greg said, his eyes alight with excitement. "I want to start a mentorship program for people who face challenges and are looking for a fresh start, whether it's in business, personal life, or something else. We'll offer them workshops, one-on-one coaching, and a supportive community." The staff exchanged excited glances. "That's an amazing idea," one of the servers said. "We've all learned so much over the past year. Why not share it with others?" And just like that, the Second Chances initiative was born. The program quickly gained traction. People from all over the city signed up, eager for the opportunity to learn and grow in a supportive environment. The workshops covered everything from leadership and conflict resolution to emotional intelligence and personal branding. Greg personally mentored several participants, sharing his hard-earned wisdom and helping them navigate their own challenges. Each success story felt like a victory, not just for the participants but for Greg and his team as well. One of the first graduates of the program was Jess, the young woman whose bike had broken down outside the restaurant months earlier. She had joined the program to gain confidence in her leadership skills, and by the end of it, she had launched her own motorcycle repair business, a dream she had held onto for years but had never thought possible. At the program's graduation ceremony, Jess stood on stage, holding her certificate with tears in her eyes. "I used to think that my mistakes defined me," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But this program showed me that they don't. It taught me how to learn from them and grow. I wouldn't be here today without Greg and the incredible team at the Copper Spoon. The audience erupted in applause, and Greg felt his chest swell with pride. By the following year, the Second Chances initiative had become a citywide movement. Other businesses followed Greg's lead, creating similar programs and partnering with community organizations to provide resources and mentorship. What had started as a mistake had blossomed into a powerful force for good, one that was changing lives every day. Greg often reflected on how far he had come. The experience had humbled him, shaped him, and ultimately made him a better person. One evening, as he stood on the balcony of his apartment, watching the city lights twinkle below, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Melania. "Congratulations on everything you've accomplished. You've built something truly special. I'm proud of you, Melania." Greg smiled, his heart full. He typed a quick reply. "Thank you for believing in me. None of this would have been possible without your kindness and guidance." As the months passed, Greg's life became a balance of running the restaurant, mentoring participants in the Second Chances initiative, and speaking at conferences. But no matter how busy he became, he never forgot the lessons he had learned, the importance of humility, the power of forgiveness, and the strength that comes from lifting others up. The Copper Spoon remained a thriving business, but more importantly, it had become a beacon of hope for the community, a place where people could come not just for a meal, but for inspiration, connection, and a reminder that no mistake is ever the end of the story. In the end, Greg had learned that life was like a good meal, full of unexpected flavors, surprising twists, and moments that leave you changed forever. And sometimes, the most unexpected ingredients were the ones that made the experience truly unforgettable. As the Second Chances initiative grew beyond Greg's wildest dreams, he found himself constantly reflecting on how a single moment had changed everything. What had started as a public mistake had transformed into a movement that was now touching lives across the city and beyond. Other cities began reaching out, asking for advice on how to replicate the program. Nonprofits, small businesses, and even large corporations sought Greg's guidance on how to build similar initiatives. He quickly found himself speaking at conferences around the country, telling his story to packed rooms filled with eager listeners. Everywhere he went, people resonated with his message. Failure isn't the end. It's an opportunity to grow, to become stronger, and to make a difference. One day, Greg received an invitation that left him speechless. It was from the First Lady's office. The letter was formal yet warm, inviting him to speak at a special event at the White House focused on community transformation and second chances. The event would feature leaders and visionaries who had turned personal setbacks into positive change, and Melania had personally recommended him as a keynote speaker. Greg stood in his office, the letter in his hands, his heart racing. He could hardly believe how far things had come. Without hesitation, he accepted. The day of the event arrived quickly. Greg found himself standing in the grand ballroom of the White House, surrounded by some of the most influential figures in the country. It was surreal, a far cry from the small local restaurant he had once managed. Melania greeted him warmly when he arrived, her handshake firm and her smile genuine. "I'm so glad you're here," she said. "Your story is exactly what people need to hear." Greg nodded, trying to contain his nerves. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity." As he stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Rows of eyes fixed on him, waiting for him to speak. Greg took a deep breath. "Good afternoon," he began. "My name is Greg Tanner, and I'm here to tell you a story. Not a story of success, but a story of failure and how it changed my life." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "About a year ago, I made a mistake, a big one. I asked someone to leave my restaurant because of a hat they were wearing. At the time, I thought I was taking a principled stand. But in reality, I was making an assumption and passing judgment on someone without really understanding what they represented." He glanced to Melania, who nodded encouragingly. "That person was Mrs. Melania Trump," he continued. "And what could have been the end of my career turned into something entirely different, thanks to her kindness, forgiveness, and willingness to see beyond my mistake." The audience listened intently, some nodding in recognition of the story they had read about months earlier. "Since that day, I've learned more than I ever imagined possible," Greg said. "I learned that leadership isn't about being right all the time. It's about listening, adapting, and growing. I learned that our mistakes don't define us. What defines us is how we respond to them, how we rise after we fall, and how we help others rise with us." He went on to talk about the Second Chances initiative, sharing stories of the people whose lives had been changed through the program. He spoke about Jess and her motorcycle repair business, about the veterans and single parents who had found new hope through mentorship and community. These stories remind me that every setback is an opportunity, Greg said, his voice steady and strong. An opportunity to grow, to rebuild, and to make something even better than what came before. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Greg stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding. Melania met him as he left the stage, her eyes shining with pride. "That was perfect," she said. "You've inspired so many people today." The experience at the White House became a turning point for Greg. His story and the Second Chances initiative gained national recognition. Donations poured in, allowing the program to expand to multiple cities. Greg found himself busier than ever, balancing his work at the restaurant with his growing role as a public speaker and mentor. But no matter how far his influence spread, he never lost sight of where it all began. He continued to run the Copper Spoon with the same hands-on approach that had brought it back from the brink. He still greeted customers personally, still rolled up his sleeves to help in the kitchen when things got busy, and still made time for every staff member who needed his advice or support. The restaurant had become more than just a business. It was a living testament to the power of change, a place where second chances weren't just given, they were celebrated. On a quiet evening months later, Greg stood outside the restaurant, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The air was cool, and the familiar hum of traffic blended with the soft laughter of diners inside. He thought about how far he had come, how much he had learned, and how grateful he was for every twist and turn along the way. His phone buzzed with a text. It was from Jess. "Hey, Greg. Just wanted to say thanks again. Business is booming, and I couldn't have done it without your support. You're the best." Greg smiled, typing a quick response. "Proud of you, Jess. Keep pushing forward. The best is yet to come." He slipped his phone back into his pocket and took one last look at the city before heading back inside. Because if there was one thing he knew for certain, it was this: every ending was just the beginning of a new story waiting to be written. And Greg was ready for whatever came next.